Paul Verhoeven's 1992 erotic thriller Basic Instinct, although dismissed by highbrow movie critics for its tawdry sensationalism, is a film inviting multiple interpretations, which is the key to its lasting impact. It is in Sharon Stone's star-making performance around which the film's ambiguities revolve, and over these last 3 decades, the audience's desire to solve the enigma behind her character has made them come back to this movie time and again. As a wealthy heiress and crime novelist living in San Francisco, Catherine Tramell is positioned in the film as an awe-inspiring figure hovering above the institutions of the city, with a creative mind that gives her the ability to not just control and maneuver people in her fictional worlds, but seemingly influence their actions in real life as well. In a scientific analysis, Catherine's personality traits would likely be described as sociopathic and narcissistic. As both the writer and director of the film have described Catherine in supernatural and mythical terms, I am going to try and see through their reading to get to the actual human being behind Catherine Tramell, and therefore will study her character's actions in chronological order, both before and during the events of the movie. My main argument, however, will be that Catherine is not in fact evil personified, but is actually a symbolic figure of death, whose mere existence makes her a kind of catalyst for destructive acts committed by a variety of people. My overall premise for this video is going to be that Catherine's behaviour in the film is motivated by the deep trauma of her parents' death and the later death of her boxer husband. As a result of this, her primary drive in life is to bury the pain of their losses through the protection of the steely writer's persona and through feeling a sense of control over her own life, a privilege which is afforded to Catherine not just by her inherited wealth, but by her own creative fiction. In the story relayed to the audience of her early years, Catherine was the only child of extremely rich parents who died in a boat accident in her teens. Finding herself alone at a vulnerable age, Catherine also inherited her family's vast fortune, giving her financial independence and security in her practical life, yet without any security in the emotional sense. Years later, in basing her debut novel on the death of her parents, Catherine reframes it as an intentional act of murder by their child, who wanted to kill his mother and father, in her words, to see if he could get away with it. The book itself is called The First Time, implying that the child enjoys the act of killing and intends to do more in the future. Many would argue that this obviously incriminates Catherine herself in the real-life death of her parents. My personal reading, however, is that Catherine likely depicted their deaths as a planned killing to try to resolve the shock of their sudden loss in her own psyche, perhaps so she could take strength from the idea that she doesn't need anyone and that she has conquered her own feelings of latent vulnerability. This is an act of self-preservation on Catherine's part to cover up the fact that she too is only human and susceptible to hurt, despite her cool and controlled veneer. Having inherited her family's wealth, Catherine goes to a prestigious Ivy League university where she studies literature and psychology, with the pursuit of these two subjects serving to refine her natural intellect and prepare Catherine for her future vocation as a novelist. The film conveys that Catherine's allure as a person is so powerful that people are drawn to her like a magnet. This likely included her older college supervisor Noah Goldstein, who was later murdered in bed with an ice pick by an unknown assailant. In casual conversation, Catherine later claims that the professor's killing is what gave her the idea for her most recent novel Love Hurts, where the rock star is murdered in the exact same fashion. As I will argue further, however, Catherine may have inadvertently caused the college teacher's gruesome killing without actually doing the deed herself. Catherine's college escapades now lead us to the enigmatic character of Lisa Hoberman, who is known to us in the movie as Dr. Elizabeth Garner, a psychologist for the San Francisco Police Department. After Catherine relays her experience of being stalked and physically emulated by Beth in college, Beth herself claims that the opposite was true, although both confirm that they had intimate relations, leaving the audience to try to determine for ourselves which one is telling the truth. In my view, the true story lays somewhere in the middle. With Catherine's track record of attracting people, it is more likely that after their one-night stand, Beth began fixating on Catherine to an unhealthy degree, as Catherine so claims. If Beth had seen Catherine having a hypnotic effect on Noah Goldstein, it makes sense that Beth would feel jealous rage towards him, to the point of making herself available to the college professor and then killing him in bed. What confirms the extent of Beth's obsession for me is the close-up of the graduation photo, with Catherine in the foreground smiling and Beth behind her, looking over at the beautiful blonde with an adoring gaze. It's clear from watching the film that the people who become obsessed with Catherine are all emotionally disturbed and needy types to some degree, making them easy for her to dominate and keep in her thrall. In the case of Beth Garner, or Lisa Hoberman as she was originally called, I believe that her own personal torment lay in the fact that her attraction to Catherine made Beth confused or ashamed about her own bisexuality, and that her lack of sexual confidence made her feel like Catherine's inferior to a masochistic degree, which explains why Beth wanted to subsume Catherine's identity into her own, culminating in the killing of Goldstein. It's clarified that at some point at Berkeley, Lisa Hoberman was warned off for stalking Catherine, and after graduation attempted to move on with her own life, marrying a doctor called Joseph Garner and going by the name of Beth, probably as a means of closing that college chapter of her life and evading detection in the murder of Noah Goldstein. Unfortunately, by this point, I believe that Beth's thwarted desire for Catherine Tramell had consumed her life to such a degree that, as with Noah Goldstein, her obsession again manifested in her psyche as a kind of split personality, whereupon Beth took on Catherine's persona and shot her own husband to death. It's established that after the murder of Joseph Garner, rumours were rife that his wife was actually a lesbian, so it's entirely possible that Beth's obsession with Catherine had been found out by Joseph and become known to other people in their circle. At this point, it's also possible that Beth felt like Catherine had influenced her to kill both Professor Goldstein and Dr. Garner, although I offer the theory that it was likely a Catherine persona that Beth had created within herself that had carried out those killings, like a demon which had possessed Beth's life and directed all of her actions. Once Beth realizes what is happening to herself, her former idealization of Catherine Tramell becomes a demonization, whereby she imagines Catherine as a purely evil woman who seduces and manipulates people in order to control them for her own sick amusement, exactly like the fictional characters that Catherine controls in her books. From Catherine's own perspective, however, it's my belief that she built up this kind of invulnerable self-image for her own survival, and that the truth behind that charismatic author's facade is actually much more tragic. Sometime after college, Catherine Tramell marries a star boxer called Manny Vasquez, who she claims on one hand was someone she genuinely loved, and yet who Catherine also jokes called her bitch as an affectionate pet name, suggesting that he had a dominant machismo at home as well as in the ring. The death of her young husband in a professional fight 8 years before the events of the film would have obviously made Catherine relive the loss of her parents all over again. If we consider Catherine's grief for the death of loved ones as a thread to her original humanity. It is in the conscious choice to shut off her own feelings and live in a kind of detached righteous existence, which can be seen as her core survival instinct, wanting to never expose herself again to that level of pain. Meanwhile, in Beth Garner's second attempt to get over her college obsession with Catherine, she tries to move on with another man, drawing Beth into a new relationship with yet another dominant and unpredictable person, Detective Nick Curran. It turns out that Nick's addictions to booze and cocaine have sent him down a dangerous and chaotic path himself, culminating in his shooting of several innocent people while on the job, and the subsequent suicide of his wife. Even though Nick Curran treats Beth as more of a casual sex partner than as a serious girlfriend, it's clear that she takes the relationship with him very seriously, perhaps with the belief that it will get Catherine out of her system forever. Once again, I believe that Beth's attempts to suppress her erotic obsession with Catherine resulted in a third murder, this time of Catherine's rock star lover Johnny Boz, who we discover Beth approached at a Christmas party. Again, this is a case of Beth once more being controlled by her own split personality of Catherine to ritualistically carry out the murder of the rock star, as depicted in Catherine's second novel, Love Hurts. Not necessarily, however, to frame the real Catherine for murder, but to become one with her as Beth so dreamed. In turn, the killing of Boz puts Detective Nick Curran on the case, leading him straight to Catherine as his prime suspect, and inadvertently making him the latest person to fall under her spell. Catherine's apparent lack of sorrow over the death of her rock star lover has been read as an obvious signifier of her guilt as the murderer, but in my opinion this attitude is merely Catherine's stance of defiance against the authorities who seek to now close in on her. As the latest muse for Catherine's violent artistry, Nick soon discovers that he is being used as the inspiration for her forthcoming book, which she is titling Shooter. Hopelessly out of league in his efforts to corner his suspect, Nick ends up unknowingly repeating all of the behaviours which Beth exhibited towards Catherine in college, stalking the beautiful blonde in his detective capacity, and during his questionings of her, being unable to ever catch her out. Beth, as living proof of what obsessing over Catherine can do to a person, now desperately tries to draw Nick away from the siren's call. In my opinion, Beth's interference is not because of jealousy, but because Beth now sincerely loves Nick herself and is selflessly in his corner, believing that she has a kind of divine mission to exorcise the need for Catherine from Nick's being, the same need which Beth has subconsciously failed to expel in herself. It's in Nick's consistent mistreatment of Beth which shows us how her efforts to save him from going down the same road as her are ultimately hopeless. Nick's failure to corner Catherine at her interrogation result in him horrifically raping Beth in her apartment later that night, which can be seen as Nick's frustrations over Catherine's elusiveness manifesting in violent behaviour, mirroring Beth's own violence over Catherine's aloofness from her in college. When Beth comes over to visit Nick after his suspension from the force, it's in Nick's mocking allusion to her frigid nature in bed which causes Beth a moment of deep emotional distress, and for a moment her deadly alternate personality of Catherine resurfaces to attack him. A crucial development at this point in the story is the killing of Nick's work adversary, Detective Marty Nilsson, after an altercation that afternoon. Having realised Catherine has read Beth's confidential psychiatric evaluation of him, Nick finds out that Catherine bribed Nilsson to get the file to her himself. Subsequently, we discover that Nilsson did some investigating into Beth and Catherine's prior connection at Berkeley, which may have been his true leverage over Beth to hand over the confidential file. Nilsson ends up being shot to death in his car, mirroring the murder of Beth's husband, just as the bedroom slaughter of Johnny Boz mirrored the killing of Noah Goldstein. With Nilsson's knowledge about Beth's past with Catherine being motive enough for her to want him dead, I also believe that it was Beth's way of freeing Nick from Nilsson's vendetta against him, thereby a warped act of love on her part. With Nick now becoming the #1 suspect in Nilsson's murder, he curiously ends up emulating Catherine's manner during her own police interrogation in the same room, thereby taking on Catherine's persona in the same way that Beth did in college. Meanwhile, with Catherine herself having observed the escalating tensions between Nick and her living girlfriend Roxy, she seems to delight in being the prize they both seem determined to win, even though in truth Catherine is the one who possesses them both. In the aftermath of Nick and Catherine's first sexual encounter, it is Nick's arrogance in assuming that he has gotten Catherine into a yielding position, which seems to drive Roxy into a murderous rage of her own, culminating in her failed attempt to run him over later that night, and being killed herself in the process. Roxy wanting to kill Nick for his sexual interest in Catherine can be directly mirrored to Beth killing Noah Goldstein and Johnny Boz for presumably the exact same reason. When Nick seeks out Catherine at her beach house, we see her in a deep state of emotional pain and distress over Roxy's death, which is the first time she has let her immaculate author's mask slip to someone on the outside, allowing them to actually see the damaged soul behind it. When Catherine cries that everyone she cares about dies, we can see the thread of losses from Roxy to Manny Vasquez and finally to her parents, as subjecting her to a kind of unbearable loneliness, which she was only able to offset by creating this invulnerable persona and making people think that she didn't need anyone. With Nick becoming confident that Beth has framed Catherine for the crimes because she was her spurned lover, he arrives at Catherine's beach house and discovers that she has completed her novel inspired by him, whereby she confirms that his character is murdered by the love interest, despite Nick's prior objections. This is the point where Catherine finally turns on Nick and coldly breaks off their relationship, letting him know that because the novel is completed and his character is dead, she no longer has any use for him in her life. Nick leaves this encounter dejected and dazed, so when his partner Gus comes to find him to go and see Catherine's old college roommate with the lowdown Lisa Hoberman, Nick seems unable to concentrate on what he's saying or doing. Only when Nick suddenly remembers the extract from Catherine's novel that he read in her beach house, describing the brutal elevator murder of the book character's police partner, does he race to stop Gus from going to the meeting, finding himself too late when he makes the gruesome discovery. With Beth in her Catherine personality having lured Gus to the designated location, she stabs him to death with the ice pick and dumps her disguise on a stairway. Although Beth would have had no conscious knowledge of Gus's murder, as is described in Catherine's forthcoming book, it's my belief that Beth was able to enter the author's creative imagination through her own alternate personality of Catherine. As ludicrous as this sounds, I believe that in the case of a psychotic, fragmented personality such as Beth's, this phenomena is actually plausible. To elaborate, if Beth's obsession with Catherine had lasted for many years and kept manifesting in violent acts whenever her conscious mind tried to suppress it, it's actually possible that Beth could have anticipated Catherine's own thought process as a writer, having already given the Catherine the idea for the ice pick with the murder of Noah Goldstein. I would also venture to say that Catherine herself had no awareness that her effect on Beth's mind was so disturbing that it had actually created this twinning psychic ability. Once Gus dies from his wounds and Nick corners Beth in the corridor, it's the mystery of Beth's non-compliant attitude in her last moments which has puzzled audiences for decades. Why does Beth show no fear or confusion? And why does it seem like she is even smirking as she advances on Nick while taking something out of her pocket? It's my contention that after dumping the blonde wig and black coat in the stairway, that Beth was still possessed by her Catherine alternate personality, and that it was Beth as Catherine who we finally glimpsed in these moments before Nick shoots her. Once the bullet impacts her, Beth herself briefly re-emerges to register the shock of being hit, and in her final breaths she tells Nick that she loves him. With Beth now dead, and with all evidence pointing to her as the killer, the case is closed, and Nick is congratulated with having solved it. With his former lover and best friend now both dead, Nick returns to his apartment, only to find Catherine there, making another one of her apparition-like visits, but once more in a state of vulnerability and confusion. This finally conveys to Nick that she was truly innocent of the crimes which she was suspected for. Telling Nick that she's afraid that if she lets him get too close he will die like her parents, her husband and her female lover, is Catherine speaking from direct experience. This is the point where she seems to impulsively decide that the cool and invulnerable persona she has so meticulously crafted to offset the traumas of her past is now no longer any good to her, as her genuine need for Nick is starkly apparent. If we're to understand this sudden turnaround as Catherine's reaction to Beth being behind the murder spree, it actually makes sense that she would suddenly be disorientated. For although Catherine was the direct cause of Beth's turmoil through her own aloofness, in the final analysis Catherine had unknowingly become one with Beth, who by the extremity of her obsession had become Catherine's actual double. Therefore, even if Sharon Stone had been the actress who was used in the murder scenes, my point stands that by Beth actually becoming Catherine in her own mind, this could be seen as a symbolic device. After a more tender sexual encounter with Nick in his bed, Catherine briefly fondles an ice pick she had hidden on the floor before his arrival, and seems to consider killing him with it, changing her mind at the last moment. In my outlier opinion, Catherine never actually intended to kill him in this moment, but was merely fondling the ice pick as the symbol of her own creative and destructive power as a writer, a power which she surrenders in the moment in order to make love with Nick again and allow herself to feel safe and vulnerable with someone. We could read this climax of the film as the point where Catherine truly makes peace with her own traumatic past, being seemingly willing to violate her own strict artistic code in order to experience tenderness and togetherness with Nick, who now seems not to want to dominate her but to love her sincerely. If Catherine has been a symbol of death throughout her life, feeling condemned to lose the one she genuinely loves and inspiring those who covet her to destructive acts, then the surrender of her deadly author's persona may mean the curse of aloneness has finally been lifted,